How's it going, folks? Antwon the Great here, and welcome back to War of the Worlds. But before I start, I would like to point out that there is a link down below for a GoFundMe. It's called A Proper Home for the Proper Villain, and what it is it's GoFundMe to help keep me, my daughter, and my girlfriend off the streets. My landlord has decided to kick us out, and I have just under 12 days to raise funds to get us to where we need to go. Anything you could do will help. Just retweeting it or even $1, I want to thank you ahead of time. Now let's get on to this wonderful book that we've been reading. We left off at chapter 7, which is called How I Reached Home. We've had the Martians show up, and they started killing everyone. So this is how protagonist made it home. For my own part, I remember nothing of my flight except the stress of blundering against trees and stumbling through the heather. All about me gathered the invisible terrors of the Martians. The pitiless sword of heat seemed whirling to and fro, flourishing overhead before it descended and smote me out of life. I came into the road between the crossroads and Horsell, and I ran along this to the crossroads. At last I could go no further. I was exhausted with the violence of my emotion and of my flight, and I staggered and fell by the wayside. That was near the bridge that crosses the canal by the gas. I fell and lay still. I must have remained there for some time. I sat up, strangely perplexed. For a moment, perhaps, I could not clearly understand how I came there. My terror had fallen from me like a garment. My hat had gone, and my collar had burst away from its fastening. A few minutes before, there had only been three real things before me: the immensity of the night and space and nature, my own feebleness and anguish, and the near approach of death. Now it was as if something turned over, and the point of view altered abruptly. There was no sensible transition from one state of mind to the other. I was immediately the self of every day again, a decent, ordinary citizen. Silent, common, the impulse of my flight, the starting flames, were as if they had been in a dream. I asked myself, had these latter things indeed happened? I could not credit it. I rose and walked unsteadily up the steep incline of the bridge. My mind was blank wonder. My muscles and nerves seemed drained of their strength. I dare say I staggered drunkenly. A head rose over the arch, and the figure of a working man carrying a basket appeared. Beside him ran a little boy. He passed me, wishing me good night. I was minded to speak to him, but did not. I answered his greeting with a meaningless mumble, and went on over the bridge. Over the Mayberry arch a train, a billowing tumult of white, violet smoke, and a long caterpillar of lighted windows, went flying south. Clatter, clatter, clap, rap, and it had gone. A dim group of people talked in the gate of one of those houses in the pretty little row of gables that was called Oriental Terrace. It was all so real and so familiar, and that behind me. It was frantic, fantastic. Such things, I told myself, could not be. Perhaps I am a man of exceptional moods. I do not know how far my experience is common. At times I suffer from the strangest sense of detachment from myself and the world about me. I seem to watch it all from the outside, from somewhere inconceivably remote, out of time, out of space, out of the stress and tragedy of it all. This feeling was very strong upon me that night. It was another side to my dream. But the trouble was blank incongruity of this serenity and the sweet death flying yonder, not 2 miles away. There was a noise of business from the gasworks, and the electric lamps were alight. I stopped at the group of people. "What news from the common?" said I. There were 2 men and a woman at the gate. "Eh?" said one of the men, turning. "What news from the common?" I said. "Ain't ya just been there?" asked the men. "People seem fairly silly about the common," said the woman over the gate. "What's it all about?" "Haven't you heard of the men from Mars?" said I. "The creatures from Mars?" "Quite enough," said the woman over the gate. "Thinks," and all 3 of them laughed. I felt foolish and angry. I tried and found I could not tell them what I had seen. They laughed again at my broken sentences. "You'll hear more yet," I said, and went on to my home. I startled my wife at the doorway, so haggard was I. I went into the dining room, sat down, drank some wine, and so soon as I could collect myself sufficiently, I told her the things I had seen. The dinner, which was a cold one, had already been served, and remained neglected on the table while I told my story. "There is one thing," I said, to allay the fears I had aroused. "They are the most sluggish things I have ever saw crawl. They may keep the pit and kill people who come near them, but they cannot get out of it. But the horror of them!" "Don't, dear," said my wife, knitting her brows and putting her hand on mine. "Poor Gilvy," I said. "To think he may be lying dead there." My wife at least did not find my experience incredible. When I saw how deadly white her face was, I ceased abruptly. "They may come here," she said again and again. I pressed her to take wine, and tried to reassure her. "They can scarcely move," I said. I began to comfort her and myself by repeating all that Agilvy had told me of the impossibility of the Martians establishing themselves on the Earth. In particular, I laid stress on the gravitational difficulty. On the surface of the Earth, the force of gravity is 3 times what it is on the surface of Mars. A Martian, therefore, would weigh 3 times more than on Mars, albeit his muscular strength would be the same. His own body would be a cope of lead to him. That, indeed, was the general opinion. Both the Times and the Daily Telegraph, for instance, insisted on it the next morning. Both overlooked, just as I did, 2 obvious modifying influences. The atmosphere of the Earth, we now know, contains far more oxygen and far less argon, whichever way one likes to put it, than does Mars. The invigorating influences of this excess of oxygen upon the Martians indisputably did much to counterbalance the increased weight of their bodies. And, in the second place, we all overlooked the fact that such mechanical intelligence as the Martian possessed was quite able to dispense with muscular exertion at a pinch. But I did not consider these points at the time, and so my reasoning was dead against the chances of the invaders. With wine and food, the confidence of my own table, and the necessity of reassuring my wife, I grew in sensible degrees courageous and secure. "They have done a foolish thing," said I, fingering my wine-glass. "They are dangerous because, no doubt, they are mad with terror. Perhaps they expected to find no living things, certainly no intelligent living things." "A shell in the pit," said I. "If the worst comes to the worst, we kill them all." The intense excitement of the events had no doubt left my perceptive powers in a state of erethism. I remember that dinner table with extraordinary vividness even now, my dear wife's sweet, anxious face peering at me from under the pink lampshade, the white cloth with its silver and glass table furniture, for in those days even philosophical writers had many little luxuries. The crimson-purple wine in my glass are photographically distinct. At the end of it I sat, tempering nuts with a cigarette, regretting Ogilvy's rashness and denouncing the short-sighted timidity of the Martians. So some respectable dodo in the Mauritius might have lauded it in his nest, and discussed the arrival of that shipful of pitless sailors in want of animal food. "We will peck them to death tomorrow, my dear." I did not know it, but that was the last civilized dinner I was to eat for a very many strange and terrible days. Now I'm continually blown away by how much information is conveyed in each of these chapters and how short they are. So with that being said, I'm not going to beat around the bush. We're going to go into chapter 8 relatively quickly because of how short chapter 8 is. Chapter 8, Friday night. The most extraordinary thing to my mind, of all the strange and wonderful things that happened upon that Friday, was the dovetailing of the commonplace habits of our social order with the first beginnings of the series of events that was to topple that social order headlong. If on Friday night you had taken a pair of compasses and drawn a circle with the radius of 5 miles round the Woking sandpits, I doubt if you would have had one human being outside, unless it was some relation of Stent, or of the 3 or 4 cyclists or London people lying dead in the common, whose emotions or habits were at all affected by the newcomers. Many people had learned of the cylinder, of course, and talked about it in their leisure, but it certainly did not make the sensation that an ultimatum to Germany would have done. In London that night poor Henderson's telegram describing the gradual unscrewing of the shot was judged to be canard, and his evening paper, after wiring for authentication from him and receiving no reply, the man was killed, decided not to print a special edition. Even within the 5-mile circle the great majority of people were inert. I have already described the behavior of the men and women to whom I spoke. All over the district people were dining and supping. Working men were gardening after the labors of the day. Children were being put to bed. Young people were wandering through the lanes love-making. Students sat over their books. Maybe there was a murmur in the village streets, a novel and dominant topic in the public houses, and here and there a messenger, or even an eyewitness of the latter occurrences, caused a whirl of excitement, a shouting, and a running to and fro. But for the most part the daily routine of working, eating, drinking, sleeping, went on as if it had done for countless years, as though no planet Mars existed in the sky. Even at Woking Station and Horsell and Chobham that was the case. In Woking Junction, until a late hour, trains were stopping and going on, others were shunting and on the sidings, passengers were alighted and waiting, and everything was proceeding in the most ordinary way. A boy from the town, trenching on Smith's monopoly, was selling papers with the afternoon's news. The ringing impact of trucks, the sharp whistle of the engines from the junction, mingled with their shouts of "Men from Mars!" Excited men came into the station about 9 o'clock with incredible tidings, and caused no more disturbance than drunkards might have done. People rattling Londonwards peered into the darkness outside the carriage windows, and saw only a rare, flickering, vanishing spark dance up from the direction of Horsell, a red glow in a thin veil of smoke driving across the stars, and thought that nothing more serious than a heath fire was happening. It was only round the edge of the common that any disturbance was perceptible. There were half a dozen villas burning on the Woking border. There were lights in all the houses on the common side of the 3 villages, and the people there kept awake till dawn. A curious crowd lingered restlessly, people coming and going, but the crowd remaining, both on the Chobham and Horsell bridges. 1 or 2 adventurous souls, it was afterwards found, went into the darkness and crawled quite near the Martians, but they never returned, for now and again a light ray, like the beam of a warship's searchlight, swept the common, and the heat ray was ready to follow. Save for such, that big area of common was silent and desolate, and the charred bodies lay about on it all night under the stars, and all the next day. A noise of hammering from the pit was heard by many people. So you have the state of things on Friday night. In the center, sticking into the skin of our old planet Earth like a poisoned dart, was this cylinder. But the poison was scarcely working yet. Around it was a patch of silent common, smouldering in places, and with a few dark, dimly seen objects lying in contorted attitudes here and there. Here and there was a burning bush or tree. Beyond was a fringe of excitement, and farther than that fringe the inflammation had not crept as yet. In the rest of the world, the stream of life still flowed as if it had flowed for immemorial years. The fever of war that would presently clog vein and artery, deaden nerve and destroy brain, had still to develop. All night long the Martians were hammering and stirring, sleepless and indefatigable, at work upon the machines they were making ready, and ever and again a puff of greenish-white smoke whirled up to the starlit sky. About 11, a company of soldiers came through Horsell and deployed along the edge of the common to form a cordon. Later, a second company marched through Chobham to deploy on the north side of the common. Several officers from Inkerman Barracks had been on the common earlier in the day, and one, Major Eden, was reported to be missing. The colonel of the regiment came to the Chobham Bridge and was busy questioning the crowd at midnight. The military authorities were certainly alive to the seriousness of the business. About 11 the next morning's paper were able to say a squadron of hussars, 2 Maxims, and about 400 men of the Cardigan regiment started from Aldershot. A few seconds after midnight the crowd in the Chertsey Road, Woking, saw a star fall from heaven into the pine woods to the northwest. It had a greenish color and caused a silent brightness like summer lightning. This was the second cylinder. Things seem to be getting bad. Most of the people don't know what's going on, and the military is now active. I'm very eager to find out what happens in Chapter 9, especially because it's titled The Fighting Begins. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you join me next time. If you like what I do here, please hit like, share, and subscribe. And if you do subscribe, hit that little bell icon so you know when I upload. If you'd like more of me, you can always join me every Tuesday at 4 o'clock p.m. Pacific Standard Time, where you can join Brockus, Zell, Lo-Fi, and myself for Proper Villains Live. Or you can always join me on my Discord. The links are down below. If you'd like to support the channel, I have links below for Patreon, Maker Support, and a link to PayPal for one-time donations. There's also a link to a very awesome merch store. But with that being said, this has been Help for the Guildless. My name, of course, is Antwon, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.